Hi again, it's Adrian, and I'm here now to tell you a little bit about my research, which we're going to be using as the case study for biological invasions. Because, as I've mentioned previously, I work primarily with population dynamics of wild pigs. So, we're going to be talking about how biological invasions may have indirect effects along with the direct effects that we've looked at previously. So I think most people are aware that wild pig populations have been invading in the United States for a very long time. They were first brought over to North America by Spanish settlers in the 1500s. And while that population didn't really establish because they were a food source, they were domesticated, um, it wasn't enough for breeding and for reproduction, basically. So they sort of died out. But then there's been numerous reintroductions of wild pigs from European settlers until about the 1800s when there was a big enough population for the domestic pig population to become sort of a wild population once they escaped from captivity, which is basically how they became the feral swine or wild pigs that we have today. So while these populations have escaped from captivity and they are no longer domestic. They're moving around the US, invading, and that invasion route has been relatively slow up until about 30 to 35 years ago. But while they're moving, they are affecting the landscape in severe ways. There's an estimated $1.5 billion annually of economic loss attributed to wild pig population destruction of natural resources, crops, various other aspects. But they also, as I mentioned before, as with any kind of biological invasion, you can see a reduction of native species richness because of the direct competition, direct predation, things like that. So with my research, though, I'm asking a question on what other aspects are affecting wildlife, excuse me, and what might we see that are indirect effects. So this is just maps that were made by USDA Wildlife Services that show wild pig population or feral swine population spread. As I said, it has gotten more significant in the last 35 years. So the graph on the left is from 1982, and you can see the populations were confined primarily to California, Texas, and Florida. But now in 2019, you can see that the wild pig populations have really taken over the southeast. And even now into 2020, we have populations that have popped up in Washington State. More have come south from the Canadian border. So we're seeing some eradication. There's been some successes in Missouri, but places like Tennessee have become overrun. Most of Middle Tennessee now has wild pigs. So it's really just taken off in the last 30 years. And it's a lot to do with the fact that they are really good invaders. They can adapt to several different kinds of environments. They reproduce quickly, so we're seeing a lot of interacting with native species in these areas that they're invading. So, of course, just like with any of the four aspects of invasion, they're released, they become established, they reproduce, and then they spread. And that brings along these interactions. And while we do see some direct competition for resources between wild pigs and other species, I'm wondering what else could they be affecting, and that led me to my research question. It's as they're interacting with these native species, could there be not only some sort of behavioral change, as in avoidance, or would there be a behavioral change like an avoidance, but not a spatial avoidance, more of a temporal avoidance? So we had a unique opportunity in that most of my research sites are in the Mississippi Delta, Mississippi Alluvial Valley. It is in the western part of Mississippi State, bordering Arkansas and Louisiana. And To control, it's a completely agricultural region that is inundated with these fragmented forested patches. So, to control the wild pig population in this area, Wildlife Services is conducting aerial gunning. And that's just basically, they go up into a helicopter and they shoot sounders, which is groups of the social unit of wild pigs. They shoot them to try to control them. And during these times, it's an intensive 3 to 5 day period where aerial gunning is conducted during the same times, generally the same time of day for these 3 to 5 days. And was lucky enough to have data from the area, and the data was in the form of camera trap data. So we have all of these pictures of every species in the areas where they're gunning and when they're not gunning. And I was asking, well, is there a change in behavior temporally? So, would we see a change in wild pig activity to avoid the times of day when aerial gunning is taking place? And given that, would the interaction cause native species to also change their behavior to temporally avoid the feral swine or the wild pigs? So I chose these species here because they're very common species in the community of rabbits, gray squirrels, possum, white-tailed deer, raccoon, and armadillo. And we have enough pictures of all of them to do the analysis. And I'm just going to briefly show you the analysis because it's not really that important. But it's basically, if you look at this graph top right here, this is what a typical activity pattern is. So the x-axis is a 24-hour period in the day, with 0 being midnight and then 24 being the next midnight. And this is the activity. This is for squirrels at one of my research sites, which is the Homey National Wildlife uh, region in Mississippi. So their peak activity is during 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night, which is typical for a squirrel. So this is just showing you what an activity pattern looks like for a species. But so these camera trap data that I had are from cameras that were deployed in the area during the times of aerial gunning, and they were there at least 1 month before and 1 month after. And I have data for several years, and I have at least 75 pictures basically for all of these analyses. Well, my study location is interesting. So this is sort of a map of the Mississippi Delta. This is my biggest site, Dahomey National Wildlife Refuge. This is two more that I have, but I actually have, on average, about 35 sites scattered throughout here. Of course, here's Arkansas and Louisiana bordering on the left, and then the rest of Mississippi State. But this is all agricultural region. So this is Dahomey National Wildlife Refuge here in this figure on the right. And you can see this light green area around the forest fragment. It's all agriculture. So all my sampling sites are these fragmented patches of forest. The dark green is the forest region, and this is where camera traps were deployed at every intersection on this grid. And this is what we got from it, from that analysis that I told you about, which is just analyzing the activity of each species to show you when they're the most active. Now, this is a little confusing, but basically, this is just for that one site I have, Dahomey, in the year of 2018. These red lines are the 3 days that gunning took place, and it's generally the same time of day, afternoon to evening. And this is all for wild pigs. So the black line here, this black curve, is wild pig activity before they decided to do aerial gunning, and the blue line is wild pig activity after they did aerial gunning. So the times that they were aerial gunning were actually taken out of this analysis is to not bias it, but either way, you can see that before they started gunning, peak pig activity was between 6 o'clock and noon, with another peak after 6 o'clock at night. But then after they conducted the gunning, they became more of a nocturnal species, which was very interesting, with peak activity around midnight. So we have this activity pattern generated for the wild pigs, and I'm asking, well, does this interaction between this invasive species change the behavior of our native species, as I said? So here is what I'm looking at with rabbits. So over here we have 2017, this is a different year, but it's still Dahomey National Wildlife Refuge, and uh, the black line is pig activity and the blue line is rabbit activity. These two graphs show before the gunning event, the aerial gunning event took place, and after the aerial gunning event took place. So the pig activity, like we saw in the last graph, was peaking around 6 o'clock in the morning. It's very common for pig activity. And then after the aerial gunning events take place, the peaks shift, and now they have more of an intense peak around 6 o'clock at night. But what was interesting with these three species, rabbit, armadillo, and possum, is that now, before the gunning took place, rabbit activity peaked around 6 o'clock at night. Once pigs shift their activity to peak around 6 o'clock at night, then rabbits shift their activity to take up sort of that temporal niche that's no longer filled here. So around six, but right before 6 o'clock in the morning. So you see this line right here. And that was interesting. And as I said, we saw that in these three species where they decided to shift their activity once pigs shifted their activity. So the interaction was enough to change this behavior of theirs. But even more interesting was this from the same sample site in 2018, Dahomey, but it's with white-tailed deer. So again, the black line is pig activity, the blue line is now deer activity, and this is before gunning, and this is after gunning. So before aerial gunning, we have that same peak near 6 o'clock in the morning by pigs, and then after gunning, the pigs shift and do that, well, we're going to be nocturnal thing where they're peaking right after midnight. But what was very interesting is once pigs shift their activity, white-tailed deer almost completely mimicked their their activity basically, and they took up that temporal niche directly after 6 o'clock in the morning, which is evidence to support a temporal avoidance or a change in behavior by a native species once an invader has entered a new system or a new area. But in this case, it's not entering a new system, it's just changing a temporal pattern. So basically, it seems that these animals are shifting their activity periods to avoid interacting with an invasive species. And that's an indirect effect of a biological invasion, which is just something really cool to think about. And I think for the future, what we need to really look at, well, for my research, I am actually still looking at more data. And now I have a nationwide data set that I'm going to try to, well, I am going to analyze and incorporate into my research just to see if we see this happening in other areas. And we're also looking at areas of pigs and no pigs. So it's kind of interesting to see if there's no kind of environmental effect, such as aerial gunning, do we see the shift in activity without the gunning present? And then I'm going to look at another analysis to determine movement between these forested fragments. As I said, I have about 35 in the Mississippi Delta, and I want to know how the pigs move between them. And then I also want to quantify the change in the shape of the curve. So more or less just give me some sort of a way to analyze how these curves change shape. Not so much an area under the curve, but the actual shape of the curve. But thinking about invasion biology, the future for that, we need to really think about indirect effects. We know a lot of the direct effects, which are still very severe, need to be researched and thought about. And we've listed a lot of those and we talked about a lot of those in that crop loss, we have agricultural damage, we have disease spread, all these environmental, social, and even psychological effects of um, in biological invasions taking place. But it's also important to think about the indirect effects of biological invasion, which is what I'm looking at here, and maybe ask what other possible effects are we not thinking about with these invasions. We don't know everything about it. It is a non-native alien species in an area, so we want to start thinking about what could possibly be happening in our ecosystem or in our habitat once a new species is present and how that affects our native wildlife. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.